January 22nd, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the Italian coastline at Anzio, as landing craft approached beaches 28 miles south of Rome, carrying men who would soon earn a name whispered with dread across German defensive lines. Among them were the paratroopers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, soldiers whose combat reputation had already been forged in blood across Sicily and Salerno, but whose deadliest tests still lay ahead in the waterlogged trenches and shell-pocked fields of the Anzio beachhead. These men, distinguished by their baggy jump pants and silver parachute wings, would soon discover that the enemy they faced was no less determined than they were, and that the winter campaign ahead would transform them from elite infantry into something the Wehrmacht would come to fear more than artillery barrages or tank columns. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been activated on May 1, 1942 at Fort Benning, Georgia, when America's entry into World War II was barely 6 months old and the concept of airborne warfare remained largely theoretical in American military doctrine. The regiment formed part of the newly designated 82nd Airborne Division, which Major General Omar Bradley initially commanded before it passed to Major General Matthew Ridgway, a tough-minded officer who understood that airborne forces required not just physical courage, but a particular kind of aggressive mentality that bordered on recklessness. By December 1, 1942, command of the 504th fell to a 31-year-old officer named Reuben Henry Tucker III, a West Point graduate from the class of 1935, who had volunteered for parachute training and quickly distinguished himself as one of the most aggressive commanders in the entire United States Army. Colonel Tucker stood only 5 feet 9 inches tall, but his personality seemed to fill any room he entered, and his soldiers affectionately called him the Little Colonel while recognizing that his small stature concealed a warrior's heart that drove him to demand the impossible from his men and then lead them in accomplishing it. Lieutenant General James Gavin, who commanded the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment before rising to command the entire 82nd Airborne Division, would later write in his book On to Berlin that Tucker was probably the best regimental commander of the war, though Gavin admitted with a chuckle that Tucker was famous for screwing up everything that had to do with administration. Tucker reportedly threw an entire orange crate full of disciplinary charges against his soldiers into the ocean when leaving Italy, believing that men who fought like demons in combat deserved forgiveness for minor infractions during their rare moments of rest. The 504th's journey to Anzio began on April 29, 1943, when the regiment boarded the troop ship George Washington and steamed across the Atlantic toward North Africa, arriving at Casablanca on May 10th and marching 8 miles south to establish a cantonment consisting of stone huts and a sprawling tent city under the North African sun. Training intensified in the weeks that followed, and the regiment moved by ancient railroad cars nicknamed 40 and 8s because they could carry 40 men or 8 horses, relics from the First World War, that rattled northward toward Oujda, Algeria, where Generals Eisenhower, Clark, and Patton watched the paratroopers practice their craft. One training jump conducted in winds exceeding 30 miles per hour hospitalized nearly 30% of the unit with broken bones, sprains, and bruises, but such casualties only hardened the survivors and reinforced the understanding that airborne operations carried inherent risks that conventional infantry never faced. Sicily marked the 504th's baptism of fire on the night of July 9, 1943, during Operation Husky, when the 3rd Battalion jumped into darkness over enemy-held territory and scattered across the island to harass German and Italian forces ahead of the main Allied invasion. The following evening brought catastrophe when Colonel Tucker led the regiment's remaining 2 battalions toward Sicily, only to have nervous Allied naval vessels and shore-based anti-aircraft batteries mistake the lumbering transport planes for enemy aircraft and open fire, shooting down 23 of the 144 aircraft carrying the paratroopers in one of the war's greatest friendly fire tragedies. Tucker's own plane flew twice along the Sicilian coast searching for the drop zone while anti-aircraft fire riddled its fuselage with over 2,000 holes. Yet somehow the aircraft survived long enough to reach the correct location and deposit Tucker and his stick safely on the ground. where only 400 of the regiment's 1,600 men initially assembled, while the others fought as isolated groups across the island. Operation Avalanche brought the 504th to Salerno on September 9, 1943, when elements of the regiment made amphibious landings alongside Army Rangers, while the 1st and 2nd Battalions conducted a combat parachute jump into the collapsing Allied beachhead, guided toward their drop zone by flaming oil drums filled with gasoline-soaked sand that burned like beacons in the night. The situation grew desperate as German counterattacks threatened to drive the Allies back into the sea, and Major General Fred Walker, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, suggested the 504th withdraw from the high ground at Altavilla. Tucker's response epitomized everything his regiment would become. "Retreat, hell! Send me my other battalion?" The 3rd Battalion joined the fight, supported by a massive 350-round naval barrage, and the Germans retreated from Salerno while Tucker and 2 of his men received Distinguished Service Crosses for their actions. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding the 5th Army, later stated that the 504th's actions in those crucial days were responsible for saving the Salerno beachhead. On October 1, 1943, the 504th became the first infantry unit to enter Naples, subsequently garrisoning the liberated city while the regiment caught its breath and absorbed replacements for the men killed or wounded in Sicily and Salerno. But rest proved fleeting, and by early January 1944, the regiment received orders for another operation. This one designated Shingle, an amphibious assault at Anzio designed to bypass the formidable German defensive positions blocking the Allied advance from the south. Initial planning called for the 504th to conduct a parachute assault ahead of the invasion force to seize roads near Aprilia, but commanders scrapped this plan at the last minute after deciding the risks were too great and the Germans might have been tipped off. So instead the regiment would land by sea as part of a regimental combat team alongside the 3rd Infantry Division. The Allied invasion fleet approached Anzio in the pre-dawn darkness of January 22, 1944, achieving complete surprise against German forces who never expected an amphibious landing so far behind their defensive lines, and the initial landings encountered minimal resistance as soldiers poured ashore and quickly pushed inland. The 504th landed successfully and moved to secure their assigned objectives, taking up positions along the right flank of what would become known as the Anzio beachhead, a shallow, Allied salient extending only about 7 miles inland and 15 miles along the coast. For the first few days, the operation proceeded according to plan, and Allied commanders believed they had achieved a significant strategic victory that would force the Germans to abandon their defensive lines farther south or risk being cut off from Rome. But Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, proved far more resourceful and aggressive than Allied intelligence had anticipated, and within days of the landing, German reinforcements began arriving from across Italy, France, and the Balkans, transforming the Anzio beachhead from a position of Allied strength into a killing ground where every square yard seemed to be targeted by German artillery. The weather turned foul as winter rains transformed the coastal plain into a muddy morass where tanks bogged down and foxholes filled with water, while German forces occupied the Alban Hills overlooking the beachhead, giving their artillery observers perfect line of sight to nearly every Allied position below. The initial Allied advantage evaporated as the beachhead became static, and soldiers on both sides began digging trenches, stringing barbed wire, and laying minefields between opposing lines in a grim recreation of First World War trench warfare. The 504th took up defensive positions along the Mussolini Canal on the right flank of the beachhead, a waterway that provided some protection but also channeled German attacks and made lateral movement difficult for the defenders. Colonel Tucker chafed at the static defensive role his regiment had been assigned, knowing that paratroopers trained for aggressive offensive action were being wasted in positional warfare. But orders were orders, and the 504th dug in while German artillery pounded their positions day and night. The weather remained miserable throughout late January, with cold rain falling almost constantly and turning the battlefield into a sea of mud where soldiers lived in flooded foxholes and tried to stay warm with whatever blankets or shelter halves they could scrounge. By early February, German forces had reinforced sufficiently to launch major counterattacks designed to destroy the Allied beachhead and drive the invaders back into the sea, and the crisis came on February 8th when German infantry and armor punched through Allied lines and threatened to split the beachhead in two. The situation grew so desperate that Allied commanders threw every available unit into the breach, including elements of the 504th, who rushed forward to plug gaps in the line and hold positions against overwhelming enemy pressure. Company H found itself particularly isolated when 25 enlisted men and 2 officers moved forward to fill a breach and then held that position for over 24 hours against repeated German attacks, fighting with almost no food, little water, and dwindling ammunition while suffering only a single casualty through a combination of luck, skill, and sheer determination. The fighting raged with particular intensity from February 8th through 12th, a period when the 3rd Battalion of the 504th distinguished itself so thoroughly that it would later receive one of the first Presidential Unit citations awarded in the European Theater of Operations. German attacks came at all hours, often preceded by artillery barrages that turned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and destroyed vegetation, and the paratroopers learned to distinguish between different types of German artillery by their sound, knowing that a certain whistling meant incoming 88mm rounds, while a deeper rumble indicated heavier guns. Between German attacks, the paratroopers conducted aggressive patrols into no man's land, probing enemy positions, gathering intelligence, and occasionally engaging in firefights that left both sides bloodied. Colonel Tucker refused to allow his regiment to sit passively in defensive positions, insisting that his paratroopers maintain an aggressive posture even during the static phase of the Anzio campaign, and this insistence on offensive action set the 504th apart from other units holding the line. Patrols ventured out almost nightly, infiltrating German positions, cutting telephone wires, ambushing supply columns, and generally making life miserable for enemy soldiers who learned they could never relax even in supposedly secure rear areas. The paratroopers moved silently through the darkness wearing their distinctive jump boots and baggy trousers, appearing suddenly out of the night to strike German positions before vanishing back into the shadows, and this pattern of aggressive patrolling began to take a psychological toll on German forces, who found themselves constantly on edge. German soldiers started referring to the American paratroopers in their sector with a mixture of fear and respect, recognizing that these were not ordinary infantry but elite troops who seemed to materialize from nowhere and displayed a particularly aggressive fighting spirit that made them dangerous opponents even when outnumbered. The distinctive American parachute uniform, with its baggy-legged trousers designed to be tucked into high jump boots, made the paratroopers immediately recognizable, and German soldiers learned to identify them on sight and report their presence to higher headquarters. But identification provided no protection against the paratroopers' nighttime raids, and German units opposite the 504th's sector found themselves under constant pressure from an enemy who refused to remain in defensive positions. The weather gradually improved as February progressed, but the fighting only intensified as both sides sought advantage through limited attacks and constant artillery duels that claimed casualties daily. The Anzio beachhead remained a deadly stalemate where Allied forces could not break out, but German forces could not drive them back into the sea, and soldiers on both sides endured conditions that tested their physical and mental endurance to the breaking point. For the paratroopers of the 504th, the campaign represented their longest sustained period in combat without relief, a grinding war of attrition where small unit actions and aggressive patrolling determined success more than grand strategic maneuvers. Sometime in mid-February 1944, during a patrol into German-held territory near the Anzio beachhead, American paratroopers of the 504th Regiment discovered the body of a Wehrmacht officer who had been killed in recent fighting, and when they searched the corpse for intelligence documents, they found a diary that would immortalize their regiment in military history. The diary contained routine entries about daily life in the German defensive positions, complaints about the weather, notes about supplies and reinforcements, and observations about enemy activity across no man's land. But one entry stood out with stark clarity, written in the neat handwriting of a man who clearly understood he faced an unusually dangerous enemy and felt compelled to record his fears and frustrations for posterity. The diary entry read, "American parachutists, devils in baggy pants are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I cannot sleep at night. They pop up from nowhere and we never know when or how they will strike next. Seems like the black-hearted devils are everywhere." When paratroopers brought the diary back to headquarters, and the entry was translated, word spread rapidly through the regiment that the Germans had given them a nickname that perfectly captured their fighting spirit and aggressive tactics. Soldiers of the 504th immediately embraced the moniker "Devils in Baggy Pants," recognizing that being feared by your enemy represents perhaps the highest compliment a combat unit can receive, and the nickname stuck, becoming the regiment's official designation that it carries proudly to this day. The diary entry captured something essential about the psychological warfare that the 504th waged against German forces throughout the Anzio campaign, a campaign where aggressive patrolling and nighttime raids created a climate of fear and uncertainty that degraded German combat effectiveness even when no actual fighting occurred. German soldiers in sectors opposite the 504th learned they could never fully relax, knowing that at any moment American paratroopers might appear in their midst, and this constant psychological pressure wore down morale and effectiveness more thoroughly than direct combat sometimes could. The Germans recognized that the American paratroopers represented a uniquely dangerous opponent who combined superior training, aggressive leadership, and an institutional culture that valued offensive action over defensive posturing. The baggy pants mentioned in the diary entry referred to the distinctive M1942 airborne trousers issued to American parachutists. Pants designed with extra material in the legs to allow them to be tucked into the high-jump boots that paratroopers wore to provide ankle support during landings. These baggy trousers became the visual signature of American airborne forces, making them immediately recognizable on any battlefield and distinguishing them from regular infantry who wore standard combat trousers. Combined with their jump boots, parachute wings, and often various captured German weapons that they preferred over their issued arms, the paratroopers of the 504th presented a distinctive appearance that German soldiers learned to recognize and fear. But the diary entry revealed more than just German recognition of American parachute uniforms. It exposed the psychological impact that aggressive small unit tactics had on German forces throughout the Italian campaign. The entry's emphasis on the paratroopers appearing from nowhere and striking at unknown times reflected the uncertainty and fear that German soldiers felt when facing an enemy who refused to remain in static defensive positions. Traditional warfare involved front lines and rear areas, places of relative safety where soldiers could rest and resupply without fear of immediate attack. The 504th's aggressive patrolling erased these distinctions, making every position potentially dangerous and forcing German soldiers to remain constantly alert. The phrase "black-hearted devils" carried particular significance in the context of German military culture, which valued courage and aggressive fighting spirit in its own soldiers and recognized those same qualities in worthy opponents. By referring to the American paratroopers as devils, the German officer acknowledged not just their fighting ability, but their seemingly supernatural capacity to appear where least expected and inflict casualties before disappearing back into the night. The adjective black-hearted suggested something darker than simple courage, a ruthless determination and willingness to take risks that conventional soldiers avoided. In the German officer's mind, the American paratroopers represented something beyond normal military opponents, something that operated by different rules and refused to be constrained by traditional battlefield limitations. Colonel Tucker and the leadership of the 504th understood instinctively that maintaining pressure on German forces through aggressive patrolling served multiple purposes beyond simple intelligence gathering or harassment. Each successful patrol degraded German morale while building confidence among the American paratroopers, creating a positive feedback loop where success bred more success. When German soldiers feared leaving their defensive positions because American paratroopers might be lurking in no man's land, They surrendered initiative to their opponents and adopted a defensive mentality that made them easier to defeat when larger operations eventually occurred. The 504th's aggressive tactics during the Anzio stalemate essentially weaponized uncertainty, making the psychological impact of their presence more significant than the actual casualties they inflicted. The timing of the diary's discovery proved particularly significant because it came during the most intense phase of fighting at Anzio, when the 3rd Battalion had just earned its Presidential Unit Citation for the period from February 8 through 12, 1944, demonstrating that the German officers' observations reflected genuine combat effectiveness rather than isolated incidents. The diary entry validated what the paratroopers already knew about themselves. They were elite soldiers who operated differently from conventional infantry and achieved results through aggressive action rather than passive defense. For men who had already fought across Sicily and through the mountains of southern Italy, the diary entry confirmed they were succeeding in their mission to intimidate and degrade enemy forces through constant pressure. The discovery of the diary and its subsequent publicity within the regiment created a powerful piece of unit mythology that reinforced the 504th's aggressive institutional culture. Soldiers who might have questioned the wisdom of conducting dangerous patrols into German-held territory now had concrete evidence that their sacrifices were achieving strategic results by degrading enemy morale and combat effectiveness. The nickname "Devils in Baggy Pants" became a badge of honor that new replacements aspired to earn and that veterans wore with pride, knowing they had been recognized by their enemies as warriors worthy of fear and respect. The diary entry transformed abstract concepts like unit cohesion and fighting spirit into concrete reality that every paratrooper could understand and embrace. The Anzio beachhead remained a death trap throughout February and into March 1944, as both sides settled into a murderous routine of artillery exchanges, patrol actions, and limited attacks that produced steady casualties without significantly changing the tactical situation. The 504th held its sector along the right flank, enduring German artillery fire that arrived with clockwork regularity and conducting patrols that probed enemy positions and gathered intelligence while inflicting casualties whenever opportunities arose. The regiment's aggressive posture earned grudging respect from other Allied units on the beachhead, who recognized that the paratroopers fought differently from conventional infantry and maintained offensive momentum even during static defensive operations. German artillery dominated the battlefield in ways that soldiers found both physically and psychologically devastating, as shells arrived without warning and often with deadly accuracy thanks to German observers positioned in the Alban Hills overlooking every Allied position. The paratroopers learned to distinguish between different types of artillery by sound alone, diving for cover when they heard the distinctive whistle of incoming 88mm rounds or the deeper rumble of heavier guns. Direct hits on foxholes or command posts produced catastrophic casualties, and near misses showered defenders with shrapnel and concussion that could kill or maim without leaving visible wounds. The constant artillery fire made sleep nearly impossible and wore down even the toughest soldiers through accumulated physical and psychological stress. Trench warfare conditions at Anzio resembled the Western Front during the First World War more than any other battle of the Second World War, with soldiers living in muddy trenches protected by barbed wire and minefields, while artillery pounded positions and machine guns swept no man's land between the lines. The paratroopers adapted to these conditions through necessity but never embraced them, knowing their training emphasized mobility and offensive action rather than static defense. Colonel Tucker continued pushing his battalion commanders to maintain aggressive patrolling despite the risks, believing that surrendering initiative to the Germans would only make the situation worse and that keeping pressure on enemy forces was the best way to survive until the inevitable breakout attempt occurred. The weather improved gradually as February gave way to March, with longer periods of sunshine between rain showers and slightly warmer temperatures that made life in the trenches marginally more bearable. But better weather brought increased German artillery fire as observers gained better visibility, and it also meant more patrol activity on both sides as commanders sought to exploit improved conditions to gather intelligence and conduct raids. The 504th's patrols ventured out almost nightly, sometimes returning with prisoners for interrogation, other times engaging in firefights that left casualties on both sides, and occasionally discovering that German forces had abandoned positions or shifted their defensive lines in response to Allied pressure. Combat efficiency suffered as the campaign dragged on and exhaustion accumulated among soldiers who had been fighting continuously since late January without significant rest or reinforcement. The Fifth Army's personnel system struggled to provide adequate replacements for casualties, and veteran companies found themselves operating significantly under strength while trying to hold the same amount of frontage. Officers and non-commissioned officers bore particularly heavy responsibilities as they worked to maintain unit cohesion and fighting spirit among soldiers who understood intellectually why they were holding the Anzio beachhead, but struggled emotionally with the grinding attrition and lack of visible progress toward victory. Medical support at Anzio proved adequate but challenging, as German artillery targeted aid stations and evacuation routes with the same intensity they directed at frontline positions, and wounded soldiers sometimes died during evacuation because artillery interdicted the routes back to the beach where hospital ships waited. The regimental medical personnel worked tirelessly under impossible conditions, treating wounds ranging from artillery fragments to gunshot injuries to trench foot caused by standing in water-filled foxholes for extended periods. The psychological toll of constant combat manifested in various ways, from soldiers who developed tremors or couldn't sleep to those who became increasingly reckless in combat as they lost fear of death through extended exposure to danger. By mid-March 1944, the tactical situation at Anzio had stabilized into a stalemate that neither side seemed capable of breaking, though Allied forces continued building up supplies and reinforcements for an eventual breakout attempt while German forces maintained their stranglehold on the beachhead through artillery fire and limited counterattacks. The 504th had been in continuous combat for nearly 2 months, far longer than airborne units were designed to operate without relief, and the regiment's casualty lists grew longer with each passing day. Colonel Tucker lobbied higher headquarters for permission to pull the regiment out of the line for rest and refitting, arguing that his paratroopers had accomplished their mission and deserved relief after such extended combat operations. Relief finally came on March 23, 1944, when landing craft arrived to evacuate the 504th from the Anzio beachhead and return them to Naples for rest and refit. The regiment boarded the landing craft with mixed feelings, relieved to be leaving the death trap of Anzio, but also conscious that they were leaving behind comrades buried in temporary graves throughout the beachhead. The campaign had cost the regiment dearly in killed, wounded, and missing, though enemy losses in the 504th sector exceeded American casualties by over 20-1 according to captured German documents. As the landing craft pulled away from the beach and headed south toward Naples, paratroopers looked back at the Anzio beachhead where they had earned their nickname and proven themselves among the finest fighting units in the entire United States Army. The statistics from Anzio told a grim story of sustained combat operations that tested the regiment to its limits. 371 days of combat for various elements of the regiment between their first action in Sicily and the end of the European War, with Anzio representing one of the longest continuous engagements. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to the 3rd Battalion recognized extraordinary heroism during the crucial period from February 8th through 12th, but every soldier who served at Anzio deserved recognition for enduring conditions that broke lesser units. The Devils in Baggy Pants had earned their nickname through aggressive action and sustained courage under fire, and the German officer's diary entry would be forever associated with the regiment's finest hour during its darkest days. Naples provided welcome respite for the exhausted paratroopers of the 504th who had survived the Anzio cauldron, and the regiment established itself in rest areas where soldiers could sleep without fear of artillery fire, eat hot meals prepared by unit cooks rather than cold rations, and write letters home to families who had received only sporadic communication during the months of intense combat. The regiment absorbed hundreds of replacement soldiers fresh from the United States, young men who had completed airborne training but lacked combat experience and needed integration into companies that had been forged into cohesive fighting units through shared hardship and loss. Veteran paratroopers regarded these replacements with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism, knowing that combat effectiveness depended on trust built through shared experience, and that the replacements would need to prove themselves before being fully accepted into the regiment's culture. Colonel Tucker used the rest period to evaluate his leadership at all levels, promoting promising junior officers and non-commissioned officers who had distinguished themselves at Anzio while relieving those who had failed to meet the regiment's exacting standards. The promotion system in combat units functioned ruthlessly, with competence and courage being the only metrics that mattered and connections or peacetime rank counting for nothing when lives depended on effective leadership. Tucker himself had earned universal respect among his soldiers through his willingness to share their hardships and lead from the front during critical moments, and his example set the standard for leadership throughout the regiment that emphasized personal courage and aggressive action over administrative competence or political skill. Training resumed almost immediately despite the supposed rest period, because Tucker and his battalion commanders understood that combat skills degraded quickly without constant practice and that the replacement soldiers needed intensive work before they could be trusted in combat. The paratroopers conducted training exercises that emphasized the aggressive patrolling tactics that had proven so effective at Anzio, teaching replacements how to move silently through enemy territory, identify and exploit German defensive weaknesses, and maintain unit cohesion during confused nighttime actions. The veterans shared hard-won lessons about survival in combat, from recognizing the sound of different weapons to identifying the safest routes through minefields, to understanding when to fight and when to withdraw to preserve the unit's fighting strength. The strategic situation in Italy remained frustrating for Allied forces throughout the spring of 1944, as German defensive lines continued to hold despite overwhelming Allied superiority in men and material. Field Marshal Kesselring proved himself a master of defensive warfare, trading space for time when necessary but always maintaining cohesive defensive lines that forced Allied armies to fight for every mile of Italian territory. The Anzio beachhead finally broke out in late May as part of Operation Diadem, a coordinated offensive along multiple axes that finally overwhelmed German defenses and sent enemy forces retreating toward Rome, but by that time the 504th had already departed Italy, having received orders to return to England in preparation for the invasion of France. The regiment sailed from Naples in early April 1944 aboard transport ships that carried them through the Mediterranean, past Gibraltar and north toward England, where the greatest amphibious invasion in history was being prepared with meticulous attention to every detail. The paratroopers understood that their next combat operation would likely be the long-anticipated invasion of France, and speculation ran rampant about where and when the landings would occur and what role airborne forces would play in the operation. Colonel Tucker and his staff officers attended countless planning sessions as Allied headquarters worked through the complex logistics of mounting a cross-channel invasion, but security remained so tight that even senior commanders learned only limited information about the overall plan. But the 504th would not participate in the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, a disappointment that stung officers and soldiers who felt they had earned the right to be part of such a historic operation. Allied headquarters determined that the regiment had suffered too many casualties in Italy and needed more time to absorb replacements and rebuild combat effectiveness before being committed to another major operation. The decision made strategic sense given the regiment's recent losses, but it frustrated paratroopers who watched other elements of the 82nd Airborne Division prepare for the Normandy jump while they remained in England conducting training exercises. Tucker protested the decision through official channels but ultimately accepted it with characteristic professionalism, using the additional time to continue integrating replacement soldiers and refining the regiment's combat techniques. The summer of 1944 passed with the 504th stationed in England, following news of the Normandy invasion and the subsequent campaign.